Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Better Events Podcast. We are so excited to sit down with our guest today, Vanessa Loney. And if you remember, Vanessa actually has been a guest on the podcast before. So she is our first return guest because she is so knowledgeable and is going to share with us how to secure hosted opportunities as an event planner. And if this is not something you're familiar with, your mind is going to be blown. My mind has been blown as I've learned more about it. There are so many opportunities out there for us. So be sure to stick around and let's get right into it. Here we go.
Welcome to the Better Events Podcast. Join two event strategists, Logan Clements and Mary Davidson, who believe we can all create, host, and attend better events. In this podcast, you will learn about event strategy and actions that you can use today as an event host, planner, or manager. Hear directly from the people who are creating innovative and inspiring events today and tomorrow, and grow your business along the way. Now, let's get started, and thanks for listening to the Better Events Podcast.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Better Events Podcast. I'm Logan Clements, one of your co-hosts, and I'm joined by fellow co-host Mary Davidson. Mary, you want to say hi to everybody?
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for listening and joining us this week.
Yeah, and we are very, let's say, enthusiastic, because we always say excited, and we're still excited, but we're going to say enthusiastic this week because we have our first repeat guest.
Whoop,
Probably
whoop.
shouldn't have said repeat because that's a lot of repeats, but she's our first person. She was on season 1 with us in episode 6. You might remember her from talking all about how to handle RFPs, requests for proposals. And we're so excited. Vanessa Loney is joining us once again to talk about another very valuable topic, I feel like, for anybody in the event industry, especially planners, but really anybody who works in events. Mary, anything to add to that before I introduce Vanessa for a second time?
No, I think you covered it. We're going to talk a little bit about why we asked Vanessa a little bit more later. So go ahead and give her introduction.
Yeah. So over the past 13 years, Vanessa Loney, CMP, has planned and overseen some of the most elaborate festivals, corporate events, and social galas for a client list that includes celebrities, business executives, and nonprofits. As the head of global planning for Blue Ribbon Events, Vanessa and her team seamlessly plan and execute events and experiences in a wide range of spheres. Welcome to the pod again, Vanessa. Anything you want to add to that stellar bio?
No, as you see, I am a CMP, and so I got that last year. The pandemic has given us some gifts, and so super excited to be a CMP now. But yeah, just trucking away here, 13 years.
That's amazing. And yeah, I always love our conversations, Vanessa, on the podcast, off the podcast. And one of the things that we've talked quite a bit about, and honestly, I feel like you're the first person actually who introduced this to me, was the idea of hosted buyer opportunities, experiences, fam trips, all those lovely things. And it opened to me like a world of the event industry that I have not been familiar with. And so it's been really interesting to learn about it. And so we're enthusiastic about talking about this with you today and learning more and sharing about it with our listeners. So with that being said, we will just jump right in with our first question, which is we always like to start kind of near the beginning at the basics. So what do we mean when we say hosted opportunities?
Yeah, so hosted opportunities are, third-party organizations will put you up as the planner. They will put you up in a hotel and they will cover your flight. Most times meals aren't included, but it's a way for event planners to come on site, all expenses paid for an opportunity.
Yeah, I will second what Mary said, that I'm pretty sure you're the first person to kind of tell me about these experiences. And now I feel like I can't stop seeing all these opportunities that are out there. So Thank you for opening my eyes. And I think our listeners are really going to learn a lot from this conversation today. But we also love to talk about jargon on this podcast and how there's so many ways to describe similar things. So what kind of terms you mentioned? Hosted buyer, fam. Can you first explain what those mean? And are there any other terms you've seen thrown out there to describe hosted opportunities?
Yeah, so hosted buyer is the most popular phrase. It is more so when you see hosted buyer, it means you as the planner, you have to do a little work to get hosted by this third party organization. You can also a fam trip. A fam trip is a way to get familiar with a destination or an organization. And so similar to a hosted buyer, an organization will put you up in a hotel and they will cover your flights. But in a fam, it's a little bit more relaxed. There are less, and we'll get into hosted buyer, but there are less things that you are required to do for a fam trip than you are for a hosted buyer. And then there's also site visits. I think we're all familiar with a site visit, but a lot of times organizations will put you up for a site visit, and almost call it a fam. And I know, Mary, you just got off of a site visit / fam, and so you are familiar with that.
Yeah. And shout out to Vanessa for kind of hooking us up with that. It was for the event retreat, which we've mentioned a few times on here. So yeah, it's been crazy and really cool to experience. They're like altogether exhausting, but super informational and like really good networking opportunity. It's just, it's so interesting. So, so as we talk about the hosted opportunities, can you share an example of a hosted experience that you personally have been on?
Yeah, so I think the Super Bowl of hosted buyer experiences for event planners is IMEX. 9 times out of 10, most of the planners that you see at IMEX are being hosted. While yes, the show itself, it's a free ticket for planners to attend the trade show, to be hosted with your flight and your hotel and all those fun things. Most planners are being hosted by an organization. One of the bigger organizations that do host is MPI, Meeting Planners International, who I get hosted by. So I've been hosted twice through MPI, and MPI actually hosts other opportunities besides IMEX. And so this is not a plug for MPI. I just love MPI because it opened up so many doors. But I have done IMEX twice, and that has been amazing. The first time when they had it at the Venetian, so I was put up in this like suite at the Venetian, and then just all of the little things that MPI plans for you, in addition to just the hotel and the flight. You have exclusive access to receptions that no one else does. I know some people who get hosted through hotels, some of their suppliers, and they also have completely different experiences. And so those are the little things that, you do want to look out for when you're looking for hosted buyers. Not that that's the main driver, but it is nice to, one, get to know your suppliers even more, right? If you work with a Marriott property more times than not, it's great to be hosted by them. To be invited to be hosted through them is pretty great. And so I've done IMEX. I've actually done an international hosted buyer in Mexico City, which was really great. They have different standards as far as trade shows. And so there was just an abundance of food and just drinks on the trade show floor from start to finish all day. And so I'm a foodie and I like a good cocktail. And so it was great. And so it really depends on the actual event itself. Again, IMEX trade shows are easy hosted buyer ones. I just did one in December in Texas where it was learning all about Texas suppliers, hotels. And so it was great. It was one-on-one meetings. And the whole point of that was the meetings, as opposed to IMEX where it's trade show and meetings. And so it really depends on the type of event that you're attending for hosted buyer.
Yeah, I think it's one shout out to MPI because you introduced us to MPI. Both Mary and I have now joined our Washington chapter, and we've gone to, at this point, I think one meeting, but we're hopefully going to be involved. I did love the community. I've gone to a couple other event industry groups here in the Seattle area, and they have definitely by far been the best impression, I guess, I have gotten and felt the most authentically engaged with. So you've talked a little bit about this, and I just really want to break it down because I still feel like a newbie to the whole thing about hosted buyer. Like, why are we calling planners buyers, I guess, for starts? And like, what is the value? I mean, it's great to get your hotel paid for, your flight paid for. That all sounds great. But like, what value do these hosted visits, site visits bring to event professionals, and kind of what then do they have to give in exchange to get all that free stuff?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, right? We are buyers, and I think a lot of times planners don't think of themselves as important, right? Like we're behind the scenes people. We do what we need to do to get things done. Hosted buyer opportunities almost make the planner feel as special as they actually are. We are bringing groups to hotels, we're bringing groups to destinations, and these destinations, these CVBs, they recognize that. They need us, and I hate to say it in that way, but they do. They need us in a way to bring them clients. And so these hosted opportunities are their way of almost wining and dining you, just so you can, one, see what the property has to offer, see what the city has to offer, and why you should be bringing groups to these destinations. And for me, when I first started, I didn't have business to bring to certain places, right? And I almost felt like, should I be here? You really and truly never know when your next client could need a destination. You want to have all this information ready to go, so that if you are asked to write an RFP or you're asked to do anything in a quick time frame, you now have a contact. You know the person from the CVB because you met with that person. You've actually experienced the space. A lot of times we don't have time to do site visits in the quick turnarounds, but now you've already been on site. You've already seen the spaces. You've eaten the food. And so I think that's the benefit of having it in your back pocket for when that time does come. And so for me, I also love the networking component of it. They don't just bring you as one person. They are bringing probably 50 other planners just like you, like-minded. And it's a great way to just network and keep those people in your network. I have met so many people along the way in these hosted buyers. You're experiencing things, right? Like you also, your walls are down. You're not always on, right? Like you are having dinner, you're having cocktails with fellow planners. And it's just a great way to get to know each other. And so for me, I have met some of my closest event friends through some of these hosted buyer fam trips, and done business with them. And so for me, it's kind of twofold. It's just getting to know it from a business standpoint and also getting to know it from a networking standpoint.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that sometimes we don't think of ourselves as like the decision makers. And when I think about some of the applications, because some of these certain trips like IMEX, for example, require like an application for you to apply to be a hosted buyer. And so when in those applications say things like, I think one part is like, are you a decision maker? But the other part is, do you impact like the decisions at all? And think about how often we do impact the decisions. Like a lot of times we have a say when it comes to the budget and we recommend vendors all the time. And so it only makes sense that you just build the network up, which it sounds like from my experience, from what you're sharing, this is a really great opportunity to build the network, if nothing else, so that you are ready, like you said, when the time comes. So
Exactly. Yeah.
Which it's just so important, I think, today, especially more than maybe we would have thought about in 2019, 2018, just in the sense that I know I've worked with Vanessa on some virtual projects. I've worked with Mary on virtual projects, and now there's in-person or virtual, but it's an in-person shoot at a specific location that my clients aren't as geographically like centered as I think they were back in 2018, 2019. I mean, I just did an event a couple weeks ago where they were like, it was in Florida and now they're talking about wanting to do it in Utah next year, or maybe Charleston, South Carolina. And it's just one of those things that, yeah, we're looked at to be like, hey, do you know someone who can do AV there? Or do you know a venue we could use or a hotel we could stay at? And like you said, Vanessa, like having, if you already have those listed or you already have a reference to go back to, you're already like 10 steps ahead versus having to start from zero and just like Google places and figure out, where that value is. So I just feel like anyone listening to this, if you've never tried it, I will confess I've, as of right now, never been on a hosted buyer experience. I'm planning on going one next month. I want to go to IMEX because you guys all made me feel very left out that I didn't get to go. Yeah, the FOMO was real, which is a very successful event if you make it that other people want to be there. So kudos to IMEX. And we have a whole episode on that we'll link in the show notes of Mary recapping her experience about IMEX as well, if you want to go back and give that a listen. But Vanessa, just going on to our next question. We talked about what you need as an event professional, but like, why do vendors and venues or locations offer these hosted experiences? Like, what's in it for them? You touched on it a little bit, but if you can just expand on that.
Yeah. So a lot of the time, so MPI is pretty obvious what they're trying to do. They want more members, right? And so at the time, Mary was not a member of MPI. Now look, she is a member. So
it worked.
It's almost a direct.
And I convinced.
And she brought me.
And then she's bringing exactly. Yeah. And so MPI is really great with that. Marriott or any hotel, they're very strategic because they want you to consider them for your next client event. So those are some of the direct, successes. And then for CVBs, right? CVBs will do a lot of these hosted buyer events. And so if you're not familiar with the CVB, it's the Convention Visitors Bureau of any city, which, side note, is always free for planners to use them. They will send out your RFP to all of their suppliers for you. And they almost get special ratings or pricing. And so just putting that out there. But CVBs will also pay for a hosted buyer or a fam trip for the purpose of you bringing in large groups to the city, right? Like that's the meat and potatoes of it all. And it all kind of then goes to the hotel. And if you're not familiar with how CVBs make money and the cities make money, it's all off of hotel sales. And so there's a tax that each hotel has that then directly impacts the CVB's budget. And so it all is connected. And so the CVB is working on behalf of the hotels. And so that's why most of the CVBs and the DMOs, which are destination management companies, that's where they'll bring planners. That's the biggest thing. It's all business. Now, it sounds glamorous to us, right? It's like, oh, free trip, but it's very strategic. And I think that's why they're very specific in the application process, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but that's why they're looking for people who are actually going to bring business. You are legit. They're not just going to have any Joe Schmo come off the street and host them. It really needs to be, it's a partnership. That's how I like to think of it.
Yeah, and you just hinted on it, but it transitions really well into our next question, which is what tips you have for applying to be a hosted buyer. And then along with that, I'm also curious your thoughts on like, if someone wants to do an event in Texas, can they just email like Visit Texas, I know is a group, or some associated organization like the CVB, like you were saying, and just reach out to them directly? Or what are the best ways to apply for these experiences?
Yeah, so I'll start with the formal application, and I think you hit on it earlier of like specific questions in the application. A lot of these are detailed. It is not so much easy. It's not just like putting my name in my email and I'm in. There is, some of them are more detailed than others. So like IMEX through MPI, you have to prove that you've done events to a certain scale, right? And so what they're looking for is sometimes they'll ask, give us 2 events that you've done in the past 2 to 3 years, and give us those hotel contacts. They want to know that you are legit. And then also, what do you have in the pipeline? Like, could they potentially be, a part of your next client? And so that, I think, kind of stops a lot of people in their tracks as far as planners. When I first started out, I talked about events that I wanted to do, right? Like events that I aimed, I maybe hadn't signed a contract yet, but I know eventually, like, I'd love to work with that client. And I spoke it into existence. That's how I did my applications. If you are starting out in hosted buyer, you don't have potential pipeline clients, just talk about the clients that you want to host or to do. And so that, I feel like, is the stopping point for some planners. Is it is a very detailed application. And then again, to your point, are you the decision maker? You don't necessarily need to be the one who says, yes, we're going with the hotel, but most times you are giving recommendations. You're doing the research. And so adding them to the list, that's what they want. They want to be in front of the client at some point in the process. And if you have any hand in that, then highlight that. And I think, I helped you guys with your application for the upcoming one. Like it's really not as serious and in-depth as it feels. It feels intense when you're doing it. Like, oh my God, am I putting the right thing? Like,
it's really a long form. Some of these are like multi-page applications.
So. Yeah, it is in-depth, but I will say it's worth it on the back end. They're vetting it, right? And they're not doing interviews with you. They're not going to actually meet you until day of. And so they're doing everything they can to kind of make sure that they checked off the boxes that you're legit. And the reason being, so I don't know if we got into hosted buyers, you have to meet with the suppliers. Like, there are actual meetings that you have to schedule ahead of time before you get on site. And you're going to be meeting with these hotels, meeting with whatever transportation companies, and you need to have something to talk about. So that's another reason why these applications are in depth, because they want to make sure that like the pool of planners matches the pool of suppliers and that it makes sense for all. And then another reason is they, as the intermediary, right, the third party who putting together the suppliers, putting together the planners, they're getting paid from the suppliers. It's almost like a sponsorship. And so you want to meet these needs of your sponsors. And so they just want to make sure it's a well-vetted, event. And then to your second point, can you just reach out and just show up? You can. You can actually say, hey, like, I have an event coming up in so-and-so date. I'd love to be able to see the property, almost like you would a site visit if you had already signed a contract. This is like a right? I did this when I had a retreat in Mexico. And what I did is I lined up 5 different properties and did site visits, and they hosted me. And it wasn't a legit hosted buyer. It was more of a fam, right? And so if you're going to categorize it, so you reach out to your CVBs. I think those are always your great first starting points. I think when we were at Amex, Mary was like, how do I get to Hawaii? And I'm like, you go to the people who are the DMCs, the destination management companies, and because that's their job. Their job is to get you there. And so they will help you plan your whole itinerary. And again, Mary, you did the Texas one, and I don't even know if you needed to plan anything. Like, he showed you, he meaning the CVB guy, showed you everything that he thought, you needed to see. So you definitely can reach out directly.
Yeah, I feel like everything you're talking about is just, I guess when I first thought about it, I definitely thought I was like, oh, it's so salesy. And I will say sales is like my least favorite part of my business. And
Right.
so like, would I want to go to an event that's so focused on it? But I feel like the way you're framing it is it really is kind of like a trust building exercise, because it's so hard in the industry to bring in someone, a vendor, a partner that you don't have trust built with or experience working with. And while at these events, you're not necessarily working with the vendor, but you can kind of, you're at least getting face to face. You can read body language. You can kind of see if personality wise, like you're saying, even Vanessa having casual drinks with them after going to a hosted dinner or something, it does kind of help you build some of that trust that you have to build so quickly in order to build your network. And I feel like that's something that's really valuable. And I know ever since day one, I've worked in events, I've always said your values, your like value is in your network. And that's something, as someone who's built a business abroad and then moved back here, I felt like I lost a lot of that in the move. And I feel like this is such a good strategic opportunity to do these FAMs, these hosted buyer experiences, to kind of just keep your network very fluid and available to do all these different destinations for no matter what. Like, it only makes you a stronger planner.
Exactly.
Which is very exciting.
Yeah.
And you also just have a friend like Vanessa who can help you make you feel excited about these things. And you do now, because she's on the podcast. So
oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's just great to also just see places that you probably have never been to, right? Like, I have a great story, and I don't want to take too much time, but I have a great story where I did a FAM in the Bahamas. And I met, I connected with one of the planners. Come to find out, we live like 10, 15 minutes away from each other back in New Jersey at the time. And she has now become one of my close friends and someone that I really rely on in the industry for work. And it's just, it took us having to go to Bahamas for us to connect to realize like we live right down the street from each other. So it is really, deeper than just work. It is really making meaningful human connections to people who are like-minded.
I feel like you already touched on our next question.
Yeah.
Mary, finish that thought.
No worries. Yeah, I actually just had a kind of a follow-up question. I was thinking about this, and I've been thinking about it with my own experiences. I've had some of these hosted experiences too. So we talked a little bit about expectations for a planner who goes on one of these trips, but could you just speak to like the one thing that I feel is like, okay, so they take the time to host me and to do all these things. What if I decide that this is not a good fit for this year, maybe another year? It almost seems like I can't say no because they spent all this time with me, on me, for me. So can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm very strategic now, because I think the first year I was like, oh, hosted, yes, FAM, yes, all of these things. And I never had the time to actually do the work, right? Like my work, like work on my client jobs. And so I had to become more strategic on the ones that made sense for me. So I now do IMEX every other year, because it is a lot. After you do, it is a lot of human interaction all day, like a lot of walking. It's taxing on you as like a human. I think I'm still recuperating from it. And so I'm very strategic about how often I do these FAM trips and hosted buyer trips. Like, I know there's one coming up next month. I'm opting out of that because I have a client event the following week. And I think a lot of times people forget that like these hosted buyer, these FAM trips are all day intense events. You don't have time to work. It's very ambitious if you think you're going to work. I think Mary and I both had events that we had to do that morning and then had to do IMEX all day. It is a lot. It is really hard for your mind. Your mind can't do two things. Like, you want it to, but you really can't. And so I don't schedule it unless I have a whole month off, where I don't have active client work. And so it's okay for me. I've become okay with not doing something every year. They will keep inviting you. It's not a thing where if like you don't show up one year, you're never going to get the invite again. I feel like once you're on the list, you're on the list, and then you keep getting on other people's lists. And so for me, I've become very strategic on when and how many I do each year.
Yeah, I feel like, because that's so much, as I hate to say it, but our time is money, really. And whether that's money that is going to a client, you're getting it from a client with your time, or just money back in your own like internal bank of just recharging, like you're saying, the amount of energy you expend doing it. when you do say yes to these experiences, how do you make the most of it as the hosted buyer, as the planner, as the producer in that scenario?
So a lot of times they will schedule your entire itinerary for you. And so I'm very strategic on how I put in extra free time. Like I want to make sure that the connections I made day one, we have time to now go off site and just do our own thing and connect on a different level. And so I always keep the first day open and free. And I think Mary, when we both showed up, Mary wanted to like plan it. I'm like, let's just wait because there's a lot of receptions that we are going to get invited to after day one. And so I want to make sure that that first day is kind of my like, all right, what direction is this going to go? And then kind of let it flow from that point. And I think from day one to day, whatever, how long we were there, Mary, we ended up with a whole crew. Now we had to get pictures and like, it was just, and so I like to just go with the flow. And I know planners, we aren't go with the flow type of people, but on these hosted buyer, because everything is so structured throughout the day, you want to let, the evening portions or those free time, those pockets, let those flow, because it will. There's so many people, there's so many ways to connect, whether you're introvert or extrovert. I feel like they've thought of it, right? They're event planners planning for event planners. And so it's a whole different experience than anything else that you probably experienced. So
yeah,
no pressure.
Mary told me about one of the like secret experience, whatever, the mystery dinner or something you went to. And I was like, that is such a planner, like a planner planned that for planners.
Yes.
like I was like, you are the perfect attendee because everyone's like, this is great. Like, I think it's a cool concept to integrate in future events, but I also was like, this is the target demographic for that
for
kind
sure.
of a
Especially because they did it the first day before it actually started. And so they knew those are the people who want to like just do all the things. They planned it for the first day. And I indulged it and it was great. I actually had a great time. But yeah, I usually try to keep that first day and night open, and let it flow from there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was a good time for sure. And so when our listeners are listening to this, how are there any specifically, you've talked about IMEX, are there any others that are worth shouting out? So when they're thinking about ones that they might want to apply for, sometimes it's hard to like search for them. So are there any others that you feel like would be worth folks' time to look into?
Yeah. So MPI's WEC, I don't know what that world something. It happens every June in a different location each year. It is more education heavy. And so if you do a hosted buyer through that, they actually will only do, I think the first day is hosted buyer and the rest of it, they allow you to do education. And so it's almost like it's a separate event with the overall event. And I think there's like 2,000 event planners that attend that. I actually had the chance of going in Toronto a couple of years ago, which was really nice. I think this year it's in San Francisco. And again, it's really great for education and also just networking. So MPI hosts a bunch of them. And I think you guys got emails there's like a thought leader summit that you can get hosted through, which I did last year. And so connecting with a professional organization is a great starting point. Because again, to Mary's point, they're not that easy to find. They're not just posted on every website that, hey, we have a free trip for you. A lot of times you are invited specifically from a supplier or an organization that you may have worked with in the past. And so I would start with SITE, SITE. They are the incentive organization, similar to MPI, but they're for incentive planners. They do a lot of fun hosted buyer trips in a lot of like exotic locations. And so maybe start with them if you do international retreats or any of those. They also do some domestic things, but I think they're more known for some of those exotic ones. Another one that I did, which was I think my first one that I ever did, was IBTM, all one word. I don't know what it stands for, but they're the international, almost like an IMEX, but it's a smaller scale. And that one was in Mexico City. They do the world one. It's coming up in November in Barcelona every year. That's actually bigger than the Mexico City one. Had a fantastic time. And so it depends on what you're trying to get out of it. I wouldn't just look for a hosted buyer planner, like be very specific, like, hey, is there a hosted buyer in this location? Is it a fam trip? Fam trips are really hard to come by. I'll be very honest, unless you're invited. It is not going to be broadcasted on anyone's website, because fam trips are, like I said, there's less commitment. You don't have to do one-on-one meetings. Fam trips are literally just you exploring those cities. And so what they'll do is You'll do a site visit at one hotel, maybe breakfast, and then you go to the next hotel, then you'll have lunch, and then you go to the next. So it's really just a curated experience as opposed to meetings. And so those are, sometimes they'll tack them on to hosted buyers, right? There'll be a whole hosted buyer thing, and then there's like a post fam, and where it's like the fun stuff. So fam trips are really hard to come by, but start with professional organizations for a hosted buyer.
Dropping all the knowledge here. Is there anything else you want to add about how how to make the most of these hosted buyer opportunities?
Just put it out there on your networks, right? Put it on LinkedIn, like, hey, is anyone going to, if there's one you're interested in and you feel that it's too much, especially as an introvert, and you just feel like it'll be too much, put it out there. There's so many people going to these events. Like, I never really say when I'm doing things, I just show up, but you never know. Put it out there and say like, hey, like, is anyone else going? Love to meet up. So use your network, your existing network, to get your other network. But yeah, I think that it's okay if you are an introvert and you feel like, you don't belong on a trip like that. You do, right? They're planning for all types of people to come. And I know some of your groups will probably have introverts. That's the point of these trips, is like, what do you have to offer for someone who maybe doesn't drink, or someone who doesn't do crazy sports, or like, it's just a great way to see locations in all of its glory. So definitely use your network, because there's probably people who go on these trips all the time and you just don't realize it. And like Logan said, now you see it all the time, because now you're part of the crew. And now you'll see more opportunities coming in. And so just start with the one and see how many doors open up after that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I myself am going to go do some of looking into the one specifically that you mentioned, and we linked all those in the show notes, so be sure you check those out as well. And thank you just so much for coming back on another episode of the podcast. We are so grateful. You have so much knowledge to share with us. So thank you again. And we are going to go ahead and transition over to our bonus tip, which Logan has for today.
Yeah. So this bonus tip is, if you're going to have a Q&A at your next event, make sure you have plant questions. So this is like if you want to take questions after a presentation, a workshop, or maybe you're just trying to kick off a breakout room or a discussion, make sure you plan a couple questions ahead of time. The amount of times I feel like I've seen a very well-meaning speaker think that questions will just magically bubble up and then get frustrated when there's no questions and end a session early. I could count on all my fingers, hands, and toes. And so I just think it's really helpful. You can either have someone pre-planned drop those questions in the chat, or raise their hand and ask them to you live, or you can totally be transparent and just say, if there's no questions yet, you can say, hey, I frequently get asked XYZ, whatever question you frequently get asked. And that just gives you some time to fill time and give your audience like time to think of their own questions, because sometimes it's just so abrupt and your audience isn't prepared. They might have questions and they just need a little bit of time for it to marinate. So come with at least 2 or 3 questions pre-planned. You could do 4 or 5, and it's nice if you never have to use them. Save them for your next event. But yeah, that's my bonus tip, Mary.
Great bonus tip. And it's resonating, because like Logan said, I cannot count how many times this has been a problem. So wonderful bonus tip. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for listening to another episode of the Better Events Podcast. If you would like to follow us and find us, we are on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook at Better Events Pod. And then you can also email us at bettereventspod@gmail.com. We love getting emails, feedback, reviews, suggestions, all the good things. And so we look forward to hearing from you. And thank you for listening. We'll talk with you again next Wednesday.